My sisters and brothers, as a comment completely separate from everything else, there are 4 major prophets. These are the prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. They're called major prophets not because of the importance of what they wrote, but of the length of the book. The 12 minor prophets are called minor not because of the lesser importance of what they wrote, but simply to reflect the fact that the book is shorter. Just as we refer to St. James the Greater and St. James the Less, one is not more or less an apostle, one is simply older in chronological age. The major prophet that you hear from today, Daniel, is one of the last books that would go into what we know today as the Old Testament, and he is the last of the major prophets to write. One of the reasons we know that is his theology is very clear about talking not only about resurrection, the people in the dust coming back to life, but also he's very clear about judgment at the end of time. Some will shine like the stars and some not so much. That's a concept that would develop much later in Hebrew theology compared to some of the other things that we read in the other prophets. And so he is almost a bridge moving us toward Christian theology. And in fact, he wrote somewhere between 100 and 200 years before the birth of Jesus. So he's very late in Hebrew theology, getting us ready for what we would today think of as the beginning of the New Testament period. One of the reasons that this concept is so important is that it looks towards a future act of God, just as Jesus does in the Gospels when we hear that expression, in those days. It's a hint to us that this is something coming in the future, but you notice you're not told when it is. Now, that's of course contrary to what you find in the National Enquirer and the National Star, who are happy to tell you when the end of the world will be. However, like so many other false prophets, you notice that none of those things have yet to come to pass on the schedule in which they were aligned. How many of you lived through the end of the world? At least once so far that you remember. You remember the Mayan calendar? The Hale-Bopp comet? Wasn't there a couple others in there since then, right? Y2K? We have this tendency to decide for God when God will act. How's that worked out for you? I'm guessing not so well. Unless you think that it's only people in modern times, there were different movements in the early church to try and force the second coming of Christ. And you notice that didn't work because we're still right here. When we begin to look at what is it that God is doing, what is it that God is about, particularly as the future, we're asking the question, how does God intervene in creation and salvation history? What is it that God is doing, and when is God doing it? And we have the great temptation to apply our decision and our calendar to what God is seeing fit to do and when to do it. Jesus gives a list of things that will be happening before what we would think of as the end of time is going to take place. Now, we do have an advantage because we already mark the end of time in a liturgical way. We've already scheduled the festival for the end of time, and that happens when? The first Saturday of Advent, or you could say next week, the Feast of Christ the King. We symbolically and liturgically mark the end of time because we celebrate the two comings of Christ. Christ as a child, the Word made flesh, Christ coming as King and Judge at the end of time. But we have this dangerous tendency to want to front load the end of time to our own time. And that's not what God is asking us to be about, nor is it really the preoccupation of Jesus, because he gives all these extraordinary things that have to happen first. Well, if they haven't happened, then you don't need to worry about it. But instead, we're asked and called to be attentive to what are we doing now and in the present moment. For example, what color am I wearing? So that tells you it's what season? Notice that it is not the Christmas season, nor is it Advent, contrary to what the circulars and catalogs you're receiving tell you. It is in being present to what God is actually doing now that allows us to see also what God will do in the future. We believe as Christians that the definitive act of God is coming into the world as the Word made flesh. This is God's definitive action in salvation history to bring us salvation and into the reign of God. But it is also to be present to the reign of God in the present moment and to ask, what is God asking of us in this present moment? And to do that, at times we need to do, as Jesus advises, look at the things around us and what do they tell us. So if the days are getting shorter, it must be the season of fall and winter. So have you checked your gutters? Have you checked your heating system? Have you been starting to look towards what comes next in these next weeks? Are you preparing for what the signs and seasons tell you? It's in that attentiveness that we are called to see what is the act of God, how is it God is acting in the present time, and that then reveals to us as well what God will do in a future time. The prophet tells us that at that time, the dead will be raised. Don't we say the same thing in the Creed each Sunday? Jesus tells us at that time, the world will come to an end. Do we not look for the life of the world to come? But he doesn't tell us when, only that we are called to be attentive to what God is doing now, and to believe that what God is doing now is not only for our benefit, but is to bring other people into this experience. If the apostles had had their way, Jesus would have ended the Roman Empire. If the apostles had had their way, Jesus would have restored the Davidic monarchy. If the apostles had had their way, none of us would be here either, because the definitive act of God would be already done. It is trusting, my sisters and brothers, in the present moment to see what God is doing now, that we also find our mission, our responsibility, and our response to God's invitation, and an opportunity to invite others as well to receive what we have been given, to share with us the gift of faith and the gift of life, to celebrate with us God's goodness and promise of resurrection and forgiveness, to celebrate with us the coming of Christ at the end of time, when he will come to call all of the elect into the kingdom and to celebrate forever the goodness and the glory of God, together with our brothers and sisters in the kingdom that will not end.